It was a cold morning in downtown Chicago, the kind where the wind cuts through your coat no matter how thick it is. The streets were alive with movement, cars honking, people rushing to work, and protesters holding signs that read, "Justice, for all and end police brutality." The courthouse stood tall against the gray sky, its marble steps gleaming under the weak sunlight. Inside, Judge Elena Carter sat at her bench, ready to begin another day of hearings. Elena Carter was known as one of the fairest judges in the city. She had earned respect not just because of her sharp mind, but also because she treated everyone equally, whether they were rich or poor, guilty or innocent. Her deep voice carried authority, yet there was always kindness behind her words. Today, however, would test even her patience. Officer Kyle Monroe arrived late to the courthouse. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a face that looked like it hadn't smiled in years. Monroe wasn't well liked by many of his colleagues, though some admired his tough attitude. He believed strongly in law and order, often saying things like, "If you follow the rules, you won't have problems." But what he didn't say out loud, at least not around certain people, was that he thought some groups followed the rules less than others. Monroe's job today was simple: provide security during a hearing about vandalism charges. It wasn't glamorous work, but someone had to do it. As he walked up the courthouse steps, he noticed the protesters gathered nearby. Their chants grated on him, making him clench his fists. He muttered something under his breath about "these people" before heading inside. Inside the courtroom, Judge Carter was already deep into the proceedings. A young man stood nervously at the defendant's table while his lawyer argued passionately for leniency. The atmosphere was tense, but orderly. Then, without warning, the doors swung open, and Monroe strode in. His boots echoed loudly on the tiled floor, drawing eyes from all corners of the room. "Excuse me," Monroe called out, ignoring the fact that Judge Carter was mid-sentence. "I need to address a potential threat outside." The judge paused, lowering her glasses to look directly at him. "Officer Monroe," she said calmly, "you are interrupting my courtroom. If you have concerns, please wait until we're finished." "Here." Monroe frowned. He didn't like being told what to do, especially not by someone he saw as beneath him. "This is urgent, Your Honor," he replied, his tone sharp. "We can't afford delays." Judge Carter raised an eyebrow. "And I cannot afford disrespect," she said firmly. "You will wait your turn, officer." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Some people exchanged glances, sensing the tension building between the two. Monroe shifted uncomfortably but stayed silent. For now. Judge Carter resumed speaking, addressing the defendant and explaining the next steps in the case. But Monroe wasn't done. As the minutes ticked by, his frustration grew. Finally, unable to contain himself any longer, he spoke again. "Your Honor," he began, louder this time, "if you don't let me handle this situation, it could get out of control." Judge Carter sighed, placing her pen down carefully. "Officer Monroe," she said, her voice steady but firm, "you seem to misunderstand how this works. This is my courtroom, and you will show respect." That was when Monroe snapped. Years of simmering resentment boiled over in an instant. "Respect?" he spat, stepping closer to the bench. "Maybe if you did your job properly, we wouldn't be having these issues." Gasps filled the room. No one dared to move as Monroe continued, his voice rising. "You think you're so special, sitting up there like you're better than everyone else. But guess what? You're nothing but—" Before he could finish, Judge Carter interrupted him. "Enough," she said sharply, standing up. "You will leave my courtroom immediately." But Monroe didn't leave. Instead, he took another step forward, pointing a finger at her. "Don't tell me what to do," he growled. And then, in a moment that shocked everyone present, he shoved her. The sound of bodies colliding echoed through the silent courtroom. Judge Carter stumbled back, catching herself on the edge of the bench. For a split second, no one moved. Then, chaos erupted. People screamed. Phones were whipped out to record the scene, and several bailiffs rushed forward to restrain Monroe. "What is wrong with you?" Judge Carter demanded, her voice trembling with anger and disbelief. Monroe struggled against the bailiffs, shouting insults that made the blood run cold. Words like lazy and thief flew from his mouth, each one laced with venom. Now the entire gallery was on its feet. Some shouted support for the judge, while others simply stared in horror. Outside, the noise drew the attention of the protesters, who surged toward the courthouse doors demanding answers. News crews appeared almost instantly, their cameras trained on the unfolding drama. As Monroe was dragged away, Judge Carter straightened her robe, her hands visibly shaking. She looked out at the crowd, her dark eyes blazing with determination. "This behavior will not stand," she declared, her voice ringing clear despite the commotion. "Not in my courtroom and not in this city." Her words resonated deeply, igniting a spark of hope in those who heard them. Yet even as the immediate crisis subsided, the ripple effects of Monroe's actions were only beginning to spread. What started as a single act of aggression would soon grow into a battle for justice that captured the nation's attention. For Judge Carter, the road ahead would be long and difficult, but as she stepped down from the bench and disappeared into her chambers, she knew one thing for certain: she wouldn't back down. Not now, not ever. The video of Officer Kyle Monroe shoving Judge Elena Carter spread like wildfire. Within hours, it was everywhere: social media, news websites, and even late-night talk shows. The footage showed Monroe's angry face, his raised voice, and the moment he pushed the judge backward. People couldn't stop talking about it. Some were outraged, others were shocked. Everyone had an opinion. Outside the courthouse, protests grew larger and louder. Hundreds of people gathered, holding signs that read, "Justice for Judge Carter" and "No more police brutality." Cars honked in support as they drove by, and chants filled the air. "Black Lives Matter," protesters shouted over and over again. Reporters set up cameras on the courthouse steps, interviewing anyone willing to speak. Some talked about their own experiences with racism, while others simply demanded justice. Inside the courthouse, things were chaotic too. Judge Carter tried to go back to work, but it wasn't easy. Every time she entered a courtroom, people stared at her. Some looked sympathetic, others curious, and a few seemed hostile. Her colleagues, other judges and lawyers, kept asking if she was okay. She always said yes. But the truth was, she didn't feel okay. She felt angry, hurt, and tired. Still, she refused to let it show. Monroe, meanwhile, was suspended from duty pending an investigation. He stayed out of sight, hiding in his small apartment on the outskirts of the city. Friends and family called him, some offering support, others telling him he'd gone too far. His wife, Lisa, begged him to apologize, but he wouldn't listen. "I didn't do anything wrong," he insisted. "She disrespected me first." Not everyone agreed with him. Detective Ryan Holt, one of Monroe's co-workers, had seen enough. Holt was older than Monroe, with graying hair and a no-nonsense attitude. He'd been on the force for over 20 years and had witnessed plenty of bad behavior from officers like Monroe. But this was different. Pushing a judge in her own courtroom? It was beyond unacceptable. Holt decided to dig deeper. He started, going through old files, looking for evidence of Monroe's past misconduct. It didn't take long to find something. There were reports of Monroe using excessive force during arrests, especially against black suspects. One file mentioned how he'd once pulled a man out of his car during a traffic stop and slammed him onto the ground, all because the man asked why he'd been stopped. Another report described how Monroe had called a teenage boy names after catching him spray painting a wall. Holt copied everything he found and stored it on a flash drive. Then he reached out to Sophie Myers, a journalist known for exposing corruption. Sophie agreed to meet him at a quiet cafe near the courthouse. When Holt handed her the flash drive, she raised an eyebrow. "This could blow up in your face," she warned. "Are you sure you want to do this?" "I'm sure," Holt replied without hesitation. "What happened to Judge Carter isn't right. Someone has to stand up." Sophie nodded and promised to look into it. A few days later, her article hit the internet. The headline read, "Officer Kyle Monroe's History of Racism and Violence Exposed." The story included details from the files Holt had given her, along with anonymous quotes from other officers who said they'd witnessed Monroe's bad behavior firsthand. Readers were furious. Comments poured in calling for Monroe to be fired and prosecuted. The backlash was immediate. Protesters updated their signs to include Monroe's name. Politicians scrambled to respond, issuing statements condemning his actions. Even the mayor, Laura Bennett, weighed in. At a press conference, she stood behind a podium flanked by American flags and promised accountability. "We will not tolerate racism or violence in our police department," she declared. "An investigation is underway, and I assure you, justice will be served." But not everyone supported her. Some of Monroe's fellow officers rallied around him, claiming he was being unfairly targeted. They argued that he was just doing his job and that the real problem was the media blowing things out of proportion. Captain Greg Miller, Monroe's direct superior, went so far as to call the incident a misunderstanding. Despite the mixed reactions, public pressure continued to mount. Calls flooded the police department's hotline demanding action. Local businesses hung signs in their windows showing solidarity with Judge Carter. Even celebrities joined the conversation, posting messages on social media about the need for change. Through it all, Judge Carter remained quiet. She avoided interviews and stayed away from the protests. Instead, she focused on her work, trying to keep the courthouse running smoothly despite the chaos swirling around her. But privately, she struggled. She replayed the incident over and over in her mind, wondering what she could have done differently. She thought about her teenage daughter, Maya, and how scared Maya had been when she heard what happened. She thought about her father, George, who'd spent decades fighting for civil rights only to see the same battles still raging today. One evening, after a long day at the courthouse, Judge Carter sat in her living room with Daniel Brooks, her closest friend and attorney. Daniel had brought dinner, a comforting pot of chicken soup, and they ate in silence for a while. Finally, Daniel broke the quiet. "You can't keep carrying this alone, Elena," he said gently. "Let me help." "I don't know what to do," she admitted, setting her spoon down. "Everywhere I turn there's more noise, more anger. I just wanted to do my job." "You're allowed to be upset," Daniel reminded her. "But you're also allowed to fight back. You've got the whole country watching. What message do you want to send?" For the first time in days, Judge Carter smiled faintly. "I want to send the message that this isn't just about me," she said. "It's about changing the system so no one else has to go through this." Daniel nodded approvingly. "Then let's get started." That night, Judge Carter made a decision. She would file a formal complaint against Monroe and sue both him and the police department. It was a bold move, one that carried risks, but she knew it was necessary. If she wanted to make a difference, she couldn't stay silent any longer. The next morning, she held a press conference outside her home. Cameras clicked and flashed as she stepped up to the microphone. Behind her, Maya and George stood quietly, showing their support. Judge Carter took a deep breath and began to speak. "This isn't just about me," she said, echoing the words she'd shared with Daniel. "It's about every person who has been silenced or harmed because of the color of their skin. We deserve better, and I won't rest until we get it." Her words struck a chord. People cheered, clapped, and wiped away tears. For the first time since the incident, Judge Carter felt a glimmer of hope. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she also knew she wasn't alone. Across the city, across the country, people were standing with her, ready to fight for justice. And so, with renewed determination, Judge Carter prepared for the battle to come. The decision to sue Officer Kyle Monroe and the police department was not made lightly. Judge Elena Carter knew it would be a long, hard fight. She also knew that by taking legal action, she was putting herself in the spotlight. People would judge her every move, question her motives, and scrutinize her life. But none of that mattered to her. What mattered was standing up for what was right. As soon as the lawsuit was filed, the backlash began. Anonymous messages flooded her phone and email. Some were supportive, thanking her for her courage. Others were cruel, filled with hate and threats. "You'll regret this," one message read. "Stay safe, Judge Carter," another warned. Her daughter, Maya, begged her to stop checking her phone, but Elena couldn't help it. She wanted to see what people were saying, even if it hurt. Her close friend and attorney, Daniel Brooks, tried to shield her from the worst of it. He hired a security team to monitor her house and accompanied her wherever she went. Still, the stress weighed heavily on her. Late at night, when the house was quiet, Elena sat alone in her study staring at the walls. She thought about her father, George, who had faced similar challenges decades ago. Back then, there were no cell phones or social media to amplify the voices of hate. And yet, somehow, it felt just as overwhelming now as it must have been then. Maya noticed the toll it was taking on her mother. One evening, as they ate dinner together, she reached across the table and took Elena's hand. "Mom," she said softly, "you don't have to do this alone. Dad would have wanted you to lean on us." Elena smiled faintly. Maya's father, who had passed away years earlier, had always been her rock. "You're right," she replied. "I'm lucky to have you and Grandpa." George, sitting quietly at the other end of the table, nodded. "We've been through worse," he said, "and we came out stronger. You will too." His words gave her strength. That night, after Maya went to bed, Elena sat with George in the living room. They talked for hours about the past, the marches, the speeches, the victories and losses. George shared stories she'd never heard before, like the time he was arrested for peacefully protesting outside a segregated school. "It wasn't fair," he admitted, "but we didn't give up. We kept pushing forward because we believed change was possible." By the time they went to bed, Elena felt a renewed sense of purpose. The next morning, she woke up early, dressed in her best suit, and headed to the courthouse. Reporters were waiting outside, their cameras flashing as she walked past. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Lawyers buzzed around, carrying stacks of papers and whispering urgently into phones. Elena ignored them and focused on the task ahead. Meanwhile, Detective Ryan Holt continued his own fight against corruption. After leaking the evidence to journalist Sophie Myers, he became a target within the police department. His colleagues avoided him, and some openly accused him of betrayal. "You're making us all look bad," one officer snapped during a briefing. Holt shrugged it off. He didn't care what they thought. What mattered was doing the right thing. Sophie's article had sparked a wave of investigations, not just into Monroe, but into the entire department. Internal affairs officers combed through files looking for signs of misconduct. Officers who had once acted with impunity suddenly found themselves under scrutiny. For Holt, this was exactly what he'd hoped for. "If we clean house," he told Sophie during a secret meeting, "maybe things can finally change." Back at the courthouse, Judge Carter met with Daniel to review the lawsuit. They pored over documents, strategizing how to present her case. Daniel reminded her that Monroe's defense team would try to paint her as aggressive or power-hungry. "They'll say you're using your position to punish him," he warned. "We need to stay calm and let the facts speak for themselves." Elena nodded. "I'm not here for revenge," she said firmly. "I'm here for justice." As the days turned into weeks, preparations for the trial intensified. Lawyers on both sides worked tirelessly, gathering evidence and preparing arguments. Outside the courtroom, public opinion remained divided. Some supported Judge Carter wholeheartedly, while others sided with Monroe, claiming he was being unfairly treated. Protesters continued to gather outside the courthouse, holding vigils and rallies. Local businesses displayed signs showing solidarity with Judge Carter, and community leaders spoke out in her defense. One afternoon, as Elena left the courthouse, she was approached by a young woman named Lisa Martinez. Lisa introduced herself as a teacher and thanked Elena for standing up. "My students are watching this case closely," Lisa said. "They need to see that fighting for justice is worth it even when it's hard." Elena felt a lump form in her throat. She shook Lisa's hand and thanked her for sharing her story. Later that evening, she told Maya about the encounter. "It reminds me why I'm doing this," she said. Not just for myself, but for everyone who deserves fairness. Despite the support, the pressure mounted. Every day brought new challenges, more threats, more criticism, more sleepless nights. But Elena refused to back down. She leaned on her family, her friends, and her faith to keep going. She also drew inspiration from the growing movement around her. People from all walks of life were coming together, united by a shared desire for change. One evening, as she prepared for another long day at the courthouse, Elena received an unexpected visit from Detective Holt. He stood awkwardly on her doorstep, clutching a folder. "I thought you should see this," he said, handing it to her. Inside were additional records linking Monroe to other incidents of misconduct. "I know it's risky," Holt added, "but I believe in what you're doing." Elena looked at him, gratitude swelling in her chest. "Thank you," she said simply. "This means a lot." With each passing day, the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. The lawsuit gained momentum, fueled by mounting evidence and widespread public support. Judge Carter's resolve grew stronger, bolstered by the knowledge that she wasn't fighting alone. Friends, strangers, and even unlikely allies like Detective Holt were joining her cause. Still, Elena knew the hardest part was yet to come. The trial would be grueling, exposing old wounds and testing her patience. But she was ready. She had spent her life working for justice, and now, more than ever, she understood its true cost. As she stood in her kitchen that night, sipping tea and reviewing notes, Elena allowed herself a small smile. The road ahead would be difficult, but she had hope. Hope that the truth would prevail. Hope that the system could change. And hope that someday, no one else would have to endure what she had endured. The trial began on a cold gray morning. The courtroom was packed with people, reporters scribbling notes, protesters holding signs, and curious citizens eager to witness history. Judge Elena Carter sat at the plaintiff's table alongside her, attorney Daniel Brooks. Across from them, Officer Kyle Monroe glared, his face red with anger. His defense team whispered urgently into his ear, trying to keep him calm. The atmosphere was tense. Everyone knew this case was about more than just one incident. It was about racism, power, and accountability. As the judge overseeing the trial, a different judge brought in from another district, called the court to order, the room fell silent. The first words spoken set the tone for what would be days of heated arguments and emotional testimonies. Monroe's lawyer, a tall man named Paul Grayson, opened the case by painting a picture of his client as a misunderstood officer simply doing his job. "Officer Monroe has served this city for over 15 years, Grayson said, pacing back and forth. He faced an unruly situation that day and acted accordingly. Yes, emotions ran high, but does that mean he deserves to lose his career? To be vilified?" Elena listened carefully, her expression unreadable. She had expected this kind of defense, a strategy designed to shift blame onto her. But she wasn't worried. She trusted Daniel to counter every argument, and she trusted the evidence they had gathered to speak for itself. When it was Daniel's turn to speak, he stood confidently, addressing the jury with clarity and conviction. "This is not about whether Officer Monroe is a good person or a bad person," Daniel began. "It's about actions and consequences. What happened that day in Judge Carter's courtroom was not just an isolated incident. It was the result of years of unchecked prejudice and abuse of power." As Daniel spoke, he displayed photos and videos showing Monroe shoving Judge Carter. He also presented documents detailing Monroe's history of misconduct, including the files Detective Ryan Holt had provided. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as jurors leaned forward, studying the evidence closely. The first witness called to testify was Judge Carter herself. When her name was announced, the room grew even quieter if possible. All eyes were on her as she walked to the stand, her head held high. She swore to tell the truth, then settled into the chair, folding her hands neatly in her lap. Grayson approached her with a smug smile, ready to attack her credibility. "Judge Carter," he began, his tone polite but sharp, "you've described yourself as a fair and impartial jurist. Yet isn't it true that you publicly reprimanded Officer Monroe before he allegedly assaulted you?" "Yes," Elena replied, calmly. I reminded him of proper courtroom protocol because he interrupted proceedings without permission. And how did you feel when he disagreed with you? Grayson pressed. Did you perhaps provoke him further? I did not, Elena answered firmly. I treated him with respect, as I do everyone who enters my courtroom. Unfortunately, Officer Monroe chose to respond with hostility and violence. Grayson frowned but pressed on. Isn't it also true that you have filed lawsuits against other officers in the past? Some might say you have a vendetta against law enforcement. Elena shook her head. I have never sued anyone before now, she said. This lawsuit is not about revenge. It's about holding someone accountable for breaking the law and violating my rights. Her answers were clear and composed, leaving Grayson scrambling to find weak spots. When it was Daniel's turn to question her, he guided her through a detailed account of the incident. Elena recounted the moment Monroe shoved her, describing the fear and humiliation she felt. Her voice trembled slightly, but she remained steady, her words carrying weight. Next, Detective Ryan Holt took the stand. Dressed in his uniform, he looked every bit the seasoned officer he was. Grayson tried to discredit him, accusing him of leaking confidential information out of spite. You admit to giving private records to a journalist, correct? Grayson asked sharply. How is that ethical? It's ethical when those records expose wrongdoing, Holt shot back. I took an oath to protect and serve, not to cover up corruption. Holt went on to describe Monroe's behavior over the years, recounting specific incidents where he used excessive force or made racist remarks. Jurors exchanged glances, their expressions hardening as the details unfolded. Holt's testimony added depth to the case, reinforcing the idea that Monroe's actions weren't isolated mistakes but part of a pattern. Outside the courtroom, tension simmered. Protesters continued to gather daily, their numbers growing as news of the trial spread. Local businesses showed support by hanging posters in their windows that read, "Justice for All," and "Stand with Judge Carter." Meanwhile, Monroe's supporters staged counter-protests claiming he was being unfairly targeted. The divide between the two sides deepened, with tempers flaring on both ends. Back inside, the trial moved forward. More witnesses testified, including courthouse staff who had witnessed the altercation and victims of Monroe's past misconduct. Each story painted a clearer picture of a system riddled with bias and neglect. Even some of Monroe's fellow officers reluctantly came forward, admitting they had seen or heard things they should have reported earlier. One particularly powerful moment came when a young woman named Tamika Johnson took the stand. Tamika, a single mother, recounted how Monroe had pulled her over for a minor traffic violation and berated her in front of her children. He called me names, she said, her voice shaking. Names I won't repeat here. And when I asked why I was stopped, he laughed and told me to know my place. Tamika's testimony struck a chord with the jury and the audience. Many wiped away tears as she finished speaking. Her courage inspired others to share their own experiences, creating a ripple effect that extended far beyond the courtroom. As the trial progressed, public opinion shifted dramatically. People who had initially doubted Judge Carter's motives began to see the bigger picture. News outlets published editorials calling for reform within the police department. Politicians, once hesitant to comment, now voiced support for accountability measures. Even Monroe's superiors distanced themselves from him, suspending several officers linked to similar complaints. Despite the mounting evidence against him, Monroe remained defiant. During his testimony, he denied any wrongdoing, insisting he was only following orders. I'm not perfect, he admitted grudgingly, but I've always done my best to protect this city. His words rang hollow, especially after cross-examination revealed inconsistencies in his statements. By the time he stepped down from the stand, his credibility was in tatters. Throughout it all, Judge Carter stayed focused. She spent long hours, preparing with Daniel, reviewing strategies and rehearsing responses. At home, she found solace in her family. Maya cooked dinners, filling the house with comforting smells, while George shared stories of resilience from his youth. Their love kept her grounded, reminding her of why she was fighting. By the final day of the trial, exhaustion hung heavy in the air. Both sides delivered closing arguments, summarizing their cases one last time. Grayson pleaded with the jury to consider Monroe's intentions, urging them to see him as a flawed but well-meaning officer. Daniel, however, urged them to focus on the facts. "This is about justice," he said passionately, "not just for Judge Carter, but for everyone who deserves fairness under the law." As the jury left to deliberate, the courtroom emptied, slowly. Reporters lingered outside, speculating about the verdict. Protesters held candles, praying for a decision that would reflect their hopes for change. Inside, Judge Carter sat quietly with Daniel, waiting for the outcome. Hours passed. Night fell, casting shadows across the city. Finally, the jury returned. The foreman stood, clutching a slip of paper. The room held its breath. "We find the defendant, Officer Kyle Monroe, guilty of assault and violating civil rights," he announced. A wave of emotion swept through the courtroom. Cheers erupted outside, where protesters hugged and cried. Inside, Judge Carter closed her eyes, letting the weight of the moment sink in. It wasn't just a victory for her. It was a step toward something greater. The verdict sent shockwaves through the city. Officer Kyle Monroe was found guilty of assault and violating civil rights. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as reporters scrambled to capture every detail. Outside, cheers rang out from the crowd, gathered on the courthouse steps. People hugged each other, some crying tears of relief, others pumping their fists in triumph. Judge Elena Carter remained seated, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She felt a mix of emotions, relief, pride, and exhaustion, but above all she felt hope. Monroe's reaction was starkly different. His face turned pale, then red with rage. He clenched his fists, muttering under his breath as bailiffs led him away. For a man who had always believed himself untouchable, this was a devastating blow. The judge sentenced him to 3 years in prison, along with mandatory counseling and community service once released. It wasn't just punishment. It was a message that no one, not even law enforcement officers, was above the law. The fallout from the trial spread quickly. News outlets covered the story extensively, praising Judge Carter for her bravery and calling the verdict a landmark moment for justice reform. Politicians who had previously stayed silent now rushed to align themselves with the cause. Mayor D.T. Laura Bennett announced plans to implement sweeping changes within the police department, including stricter oversight, mandatory bias training, and an independent review board to investigate complaints against officers. But not everyone celebrated. Monroe's supporters argued that he was being made a scapegoat, blaming the media and activists for exaggerating the case. Some officers grumbled about how the verdict would make their jobs harder, claiming they'd be too afraid to act without facing consequences. Captain Greg Miller, Monroe's former superior, tried to defend him during interviews but only succeeded in making himself look complicit. Public trust in the police department hit an all-time low. Amid the chaos, Judge Carter focused on moving forward. She returned to her duties at the courthouse, though it wasn't easy. Every day she faced reminders of the trial, reporters camped outside, strangers stopping her on the street to thank her, and even anonymous threats that continued to trickle in. Her security detail remained vigilant, ensuring she and her family were safe. Despite the challenges, she refused to let fear dictate her life. One evening, as she sat in her living room with Daniel, Brooks, Maya, and George, she reflected on everything that had happened. "This isn't the end," she said softly. "It's just the beginning." "What do you mean?" Maya asked, curling up on the couch beside her. "I mean, we've won this battle, but there's still so much work to do," Elena explained. "Changing hearts and minds takes time. We need to keep pushing for reforms, for accountability, for fairness." George nodded thoughtfully. "You're right," he said. "But remember, you don't have to carry this alone. There are people ready to help." Elena smiled. "I know, and I'm grateful for that." Over the next few weeks, she threw herself into advocacy work. She spoke at community meetings, sharing her story and encouraging others to speak out against injustice. She partnered with local organizations to push for policy changes, such as body cameras for all officers and better support systems for victims of police misconduct. Her efforts inspired countless people, from students to senior citizens, to join the movement. Detective Ryan Holt also became more involved. After testifying at the trial, he realized he couldn't go back to staying silent. He started mentoring younger officers, teaching them the importance of integrity and respect. He also worked closely with the newly formed review board, helping to investigate complaints and hold bad actors accountable. Though he faced backlash from some colleagues, he stood firm, knowing he was doing the right thing. Sophie Myers, the journalist who exposed Monroe's misconduct, continued to shine a light on systemic issues within law enforcement. Her articles sparked conversations across the country, prompting other cities to examine their own police departments. She often credited Judge Carter for inspiring her to dig deeper. "She showed us what courage looks like," Sophie wrote in one column. Now it's our turn to follow her lead. As months passed, the impact of the trial grew clearer. The police department implemented many of the proposed reforms, albeit slowly and with resistance. Officers began wearing body cameras, and disciplinary actions against those accused of misconduct increased significantly. Community relations improved slightly, though tensions remained. Trust, after all, took longer to rebuild than policies did to change. Judge Carter's influence extended beyond Chicago. Activists in other states reached out to her, seeking advice on how to tackle similar issues in their communities. She traveled occasionally to give speeches, always emphasizing the importance of persistence and unity. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she told audiences, "but if we stand together and refuse to give up, we can create a better future." Her words resonated deeply, especially with young people. Students invited her to speak at schools and universities, eager to learn from her experience. During one such visit, a high school girl approached her after the talk. "Thank you for standing up," the girl said shyly. "I want to be like you when I grow up." Elena knelt down to meet the girl's eye level. "You already are," she replied warmly. "Anyone who fights for what's right is following in my footsteps." Back home, Maya noticed a shift in her mother. The stress and exhaustion hadn't disappeared entirely, but there was a new lightness to her step. She laughed more, spent quality time with her family, and seemed genuinely happy despite the ongoing challenges. Maya admired her strength, realizing how much she had grown throughout the ordeal. George, too, marveled at his daughter's resilience. One afternoon, as they sipped tea together, he said, "You've done something incredible, Elena. Your mom would have been so proud." Elena smiled, feeling a pang of nostalgia for her late mother. "I wish she could have seen this," she admitted. "But I feel her with me every day." The holidays approached, bringing a sense of renewal. The Carters decorated their home with twinkling lights and festive wreaths, filling the air with warmth and laughter. Friends and neighbors stopped by to celebrate, thanking Elena for her courage and wishing her well. It was a reminder that even in the darkest times, kindness and connection prevailed. Still, Elena knew the fight wasn't over. Racism and inequality weren't problems that could be solved overnight. But she also knew that progress was possible. One step, one voice, one action at a time. As she stood on her porch one snowy evening, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, she felt a deep sense of purpose. She had taken a stand, and the world was listening. Months after the trial, life in Chicago began to settle into a new rhythm. The streets still buzzed with energy, but the anger and tension that had once dominated the city started to fade. People talked about hope now, hope for change, for fairness, for a better tomorrow. Judge Elena Carter became a symbol of that hope, not just in Chicago but across the country. Her courage inspired countless others to speak out against injustice, proving that one person's actions could spark a movement. Elena herself remained humble despite the praise she received. She continued her work at the courthouse, presiding over cases with the same calm authority she always had. But something was different now. People looked at her differently, not just as a judge, but as someone who stood up for what was right. Lawyers, defendants, and even jurors approached her after hearings to express their gratitude. Strangers stopped her on the street to thank her for inspiring them to believe in justice again. Her family noticed the change too. Maya, now more confident than ever, joined a youth group focused on social justice. She organized fundraisers and rallies, channeling her mother's determination into action. George, meanwhile, took pride in seeing his daughter become a leader. He often joked that he'd known all along she was destined for greatness. "You've always had fire in your heart," he told her one evening. "Now the whole world sees it." Despite the progress, challenges remained. Some officers resisted the reforms, claiming they made their jobs harder. Others argued that the changes didn't go far enough. Tensions between the police department and the community lingered, though efforts to bridge the gap slowly gained traction. Community meetings brought residents and officers together to discuss concerns and find solutions. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Detective Ryan Holt played a key role in these efforts. After testifying at the trial, he became a voice for reform within the department. He worked tirelessly to rebuild trust, attending town halls and mentoring younger officers. His colleagues were divided. Some respected him, while others resented him, but he refused to back down. "If we don't change, nothing will," he said during a meeting with fellow detectives. "We owe it to the people we serve." Sophie Myers, the journalist who exposed Monroe's misconduct, continued to shine a light on systemic issues. Her articles sparked debates and prompted other cities to examine their own police departments. She stayed in touch with Judge Carter, often seeking advice or sharing updates on her latest investigations. Together, they became a powerful force for accountability and transparency. As winter gave way to spring, Judge Carter prepared for a national conference on justice reform. Organizers had invited her to deliver the keynote speech, recognizing her role in sparking widespread conversations about racism and inequality. For weeks, she worked on her remarks, carefully choosing each word to convey both the urgency of the moment and the possibility of change. The day of the conference arrived, and Elena stepped onto the stage to thunderous applause. Hundreds of people filled the auditorium, their faces reflecting a mix of admiration and anticipation. Reporters crowded the front row, cameras flashing as she adjusted the microphone. Taking a deep breath, she began to speak. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she said, her voice steady and clear. "It starts with small steps, speaking up when you see something wrong, standing by those who need support, refusing to accept injustice as normal. That's how movements grow, one act of courage at a time." She shared her story, describing the events that led to the trial and the lessons she learned along the way. She spoke about the importance of persistence, of never giving up even when the odds seemed insurmountable. "There will be setbacks," she admitted. "There will be moments when you feel like nothing is changing. But I promise you this, if we keep pushing forward, if we refuse to stay silent, we can create a better future." Her words resonated deeply, drawing cheers and standing ovations from the crowd. As she concluded her speech, she left them with a final thought. "This isn't just my fight, it's ours. Together we can build a world where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. Let's make that vision a reality." Afterward, attendees lined up to meet her, eager to shake her hand and share their stories. Many thanked her for giving them hope, while others pledged to join the fight for reform. Among them was a young man named Marcus, who had traveled from Detroit to attend the conference. "Your story made me realize I can make a difference too," he told her. "I'm going back home to start organizing." Elena smiled, feeling a surge of pride. This was why she had fought so hard, to inspire others to take action. Change didn't come from one person alone. It came from collective effort, from ordinary people working together toward a common goal. Back in Chicago, the effects of her advocacy continued to ripple outward. Schools incorporated discussions about justice and equality into their curriculums. Businesses adopted diversity training programs, encouraging employees to confront bias and promote inclusivity. Even local politicians, once hesitant to address systemic issues, championed policies aimed at reducing inequality. The police department, though slow to adapt, began showing signs of improvement. Body cameras captured interactions between officers and citizens, providing accountability. Complaints of misconduct decreased, thanks in part to the independent review board Detective Holt helped establish. Officers who embraced the reforms found themselves building stronger relationships with the communities they served. For Elena, the journey wasn't easy, but it was worth it. She carried scars from the ordeal, emotional wounds that would take time to heal, but she also carried memories of triumph. Memories of protesters chanting her name, of strangers thanking her for giving them hope, of young people vowing to carry the torch. One evening, as she sat on her porch watching the sunset, Maya joined her. "Do you ever think about how different things might have been if you hadn't filed that lawsuit?" she asked. Elena nodded. "All the time," she replied. "But I don't regret it. If I hadn't stood up, none of this would have happened. Sometimes you have to take risks to make a difference." Maya leaned her head on her mother's shoulder. "Well, I'm glad you did. You're my hero." Elena chuckled softly. "I'm nobody's hero. I'm just someone who believes in doing the right thing, no matter how hard it is." And that was true. She wasn't a superhero or a celebrity. She was simply a woman who chose to stand up when it mattered most. Her courage ignited a fire that spread far beyond her wildest dreams, proving that even the smallest acts of bravery could lead to monumental change. As night fell and the stars appeared in the sky, Elena felt a deep sense of peace. The road ahead would still be long and there would be obstacles to overcome, but she knew she wasn't alone. Across the city, across the country, people were standing together, united by a shared vision of justice and equality.